and airbending is absolutely the most underestimated element in the world of Avatar. And this statement is including fans of the series, as well as major canonical figures such as Fire Lord Ozai. So I'd like to explore not only why this is, but also just how flawed this thinking may be. For over a century of the world's history, airbending had been a lost art from a bygone era. And even when Avatar Aang resurfaced into the world, he was the only airbender for several years. But when he did, with the exception of those as old as the likes of, say, Earth King Bumi or Guru Patik, nobody in the world had ever faced an airbender in combat. And with that, the level of unpredictability this now unorthodox style of bending provided was able to get the better of some of the most accomplished combatants in the series. And to be real with you, this unfamiliarity certainly helps, but it's not at all the sole reason why this is the case. Air is said to be the element of freedom. As such, air nomads are trained to be crafty, quick thinkers capable of implementing a level of ingenuity into everything they do. A possible reason for this being the pacifist ways of their people. Airbenders are sworn to engage in combat as a last resort, and as such, are masterful in their avoidance and or redirection of incoming attacks. Just about any overzealous aggressor will have a hard time dealing with an airbender capable of defeating them without dealing even a single blow of their own. Because of this, it's common for those unfamiliar with their ways to see such acts as cowardice rather than cleverness. Despite never possessing a formal military, the air nomads had arguably the most rigid culture of the four nations. Rather than being led by monarchs of any sort, the monks were led by the teachings and wisdom of their elders, whom belonged to a council present in each of the air temples. To take this a step further, it's my interpretation that air nomad culture rebukes the division of households as well, as young airbenders, rather than being raised by their birth parents with your typical family structure, were brought up by the collective, eliciting a further sense of unity amongst them. This also happened to be the only society entirely comprised of benders. Unhindered by concepts such as poverty, prejudice, birthright, or gender inequality, airbending was able to progress down an all-inclusive yet unadulterated path more so than any other discipline. As such, the ascension towards mastery and furthering of such knowledge was to be an air nomad's greatest ambition. Obtained either by contributing to the art by inventing a new technique, or the completion of its 36 levels, an airbender's accomplishment would be commemorated with the bestowal of their traditional tattoos. For instance, Aang only completed 35 of the 36 airbending levels. However, his invention of the air scooter made him the youngest airbending master in history during his time. Unfortunately, such teachings would at large remain lost for a century following the genocide of the air nomads induced by the Fire Nation. Even before the beginning of the Avatar cycle, the users of air possessed a connection to the spirits unrivaled by any other culture. The spirit wilds were at large considered dangerous, and spirits themselves deemed malicious by the humans of this world. Yet the cultural predecessors to the air nomads coexisted peacefully with them with a level of mutual respect, which provided them with knowledge of things like the inherent relationship between the great spirits Rava and Vatu. With Season 2 of The Legend of Korra, we're introduced to the advanced bending technique of spiritual projection by Jinora. Requiring a particularly powerful connection to the spirits, this technique, despite having virtually no offensive potential on its own, as far as we've seen, is incredibly useful. By projecting one's own spirit beyond the confines of their physical body, an airbender may traverse elsewhere in mere seconds, completely unhindered by things such as walls, climate, terrain, or solid objects, while still retaining the ability to communicate with others. In terms of non-aggressive deliberation, this could very well be considered the greatest airbending technique, as it manages to encapsulate so many other principles with its usage alone. With Avatar Korra's decision to keep the physical world connected to the spirit world, even after harmonic convergence, many non-benders found themselves gifted with the power of air, and by extension, bringing airbending back from the brink of extinction. Today, this second wind of the Air Nation attempts to cultivate their former presence lost to the world, while also sporting a more active role in worldly affairs as ambassadors of peace and unity, whether they be human or spiritual quarrels. And because the return of airbending to the world was rather indiscriminate, this new generation of airbenders is very culturally diverse, with members hailing from all different parts of the world. Now, because the Korra team decided against extensive Fire Nation inclusion, the search for new airbenders was limited to the Earth Kingdom, and oddly enough never reoccurred elsewhere, despite Korra being related to the chieftains of both the northern and southern water tribes, but I digress. Because their origins span a multitude of different financial, social, and geological backgrounds, they can make for some pretty great diplomats, sort of emulating the presence of the Avatar. However, for every formal member of Tenzin's recultivation of the air nomad culture, there has to be a ton of unaffiliated airbenders out there, which is a bit unfortunate considering what came before, but really such division certainly allows for more interesting approaches to the discipline to spring forth. And as Avatar Aang once said, when we hit our lowest point, we are open to the greatest change. With the ideals and practices of airbenders no longer being completely unified as they once were, we may now find ourselves with airbending characters failing to adhere to pacifist practices, which I believe to be incredibly dangerous. The unhinged bending of air is for the most part uncharted territory, although it would be rather remiss of me to say that it's never happened before, as we know Monk Gyatso to have taken several firebenders out before dying himself. However, it's not something that has ever been at the forefront of their teachings. Lethality had always been avoided, and so the removal of that stipulation is a major change. And to that effect, Zahir served to be an incredible display of this. Having been a formidable martial artist prior to receiving his bending abilities, Zahir was able to concoct a self-taught brand of airbending which both adhered to the major teachings of the great Guru Lahima, an enlightened airbender of legend, and retained a level of unrestricted lethality. Now, of course, Zahir stands to be a rather impressive individual, but I think it's important to remember that at the end of the day, he boasted an unrefined, makeshift usage of the discipline concocted over the course of only a few weeks. That is kind of terrifying. Just imagine if he had more time with it. Now, although it may be considered counterintuitive to the points I'm attempting to prove with this video, I'd like to talk a bit about Zahir's infamous asphyxiation technique. Over the course of this series of videos focused on the different bending disciplines, a commonality amongst many airbending advocates has been the mention of this particular move. And don't get me wrong, I do think it's a pretty savage thing to do, especially as a contradiction to traditional airbending teachings, but I do not think it's this big game changer on par with things like bloodbending or anything like that, at least not in its current state. Zahir used this technique to kill the Earth Queen, but in no way were the two engaged in combat with one another. Remember, the Earth Queen was a non-combatant of a non-bender, one that could by no stretch of the imagination put up any sort of feasible fight against such a man. With that being said, there was nothing to stop Zahir from conducting this slow suffocation. Later in the season, he attempts to do the same thing to Avatar Korra with full urgency to end her mid-Avatar state, and not only is it still a dreadfully long process, but he also only attempts to do so after rendering her unconscious. which to me isn't all that impressive. It's not as if he can swiftly collapse her lungs or cause some irregularity within the oxygenation of her blood, which are things I have seen many people speak about, by the way. Which isn't to say it's impossible, but it is a facet of airbending that has not only never been explored, but certainly requires a level of mastery beyond anything we have ever seen in the series thus far. Anyhow, another example I'm rather interested in, whom actually predates Aang by an entire Avatar cycle, would be Avatar Yang Chen. Avatar Yang Chen was celebrated by the Air Nomads, similarly to how Avatar Kyoshi is celebrated by the Earth Kingdom. However, when seeking her advice prior to his clash with Fire Lord Ozai, Avatar Yang Chen expressed to Aang that despite being an airbending master, that she considered the duties of the Avatar to be paramount, even when in contention with the ways of her people. I really wish we had some sort of documentation of her doing as such, but just knowing her stance is fascinating on its own. Personally, I have a pretty hard time underestimating airbenders at this point. I mean, just thinking back to Book 3 of The Legend of Korra, where it took the combined forces of Zahir, a combatant skilled enough to defeat Kaya, a renowned waterbender personally trained by the likes of an adult Katara, Minghua, an exceptional waterbender boasting one of the most unorthodox fighting styles in the entire franchise, Pli, an incredibly precise combustion bender who had trained to be an assassin since childhood, and Ghazan, a lava bender who had toppled the walls of Ba Sing Se in mere moments to defeat Master Tenzin. I am baffled. It took a 4-on-1 handicap match with a pre-established preservation of life handicap for them to take this man out. Wow. Another instance of peculiar intrigue occurs during Book 4 of Korra, where the combined forces of only 2 airbenders was enough to keep the entirety of Kuvira's great army at bay. And had it not been for the presence of mech suits, they would have no way of breaking through. That to me is very impressive. And funny enough, there seems to be a trend of Korra's main antagonist being dealt the power of air as a final blow. It happened to Amon and he ran away, it happened to Unalaq, it happened to Zahir and he was done, happened to Kuvira and she was done. Not sure if that was intentional, but it is what it is. As far as cultures and practices go, air to me is the most fascinating element of them all. Not only am I fascinated by what came before, but I am also thoroughly engrossed in what has yet to come. And so my hope is that at some point we're provided with a glimpse at a future comprised of varying airbending paths. And I also hope that you have enjoyed this installment in our bending series of videos and have been blown away by the state of airbending both in the past and the present as much as I have been. Admittedly, this video took a while to produce and share with you all due to a combination of circumstances ranging from my recent move to another state, as well as the effort and attention to detail that of course goes into creating content that I can be proud of. But with that being said, I am now in a far more creatively stimulating and healthy environment, allowing me to create more of the content that I long for and you seem to enjoy. So expect plenty more from me both here and elsewhere, like my anime channel Otaku, where my best friend, whom I now live with, and I cover things like My Hero Academia with the same level of quality you've come to expect from me over here. With this airbending video now being complete, we have effectively covered each of the 4 elements, but don't think we're done. Our bending series is only just the beginning, as I have a ton of other Avatar topics that I would love to cover. And how on earth could I possibly close out a bending series without firstly bringing to attention that which binds them all, the Avatar. Thank you all so much for watching and have an awesome day. I love you.
Airbending slice! Airship slice!
Anyone besides Otaku who already studied this?